Path of Exile 2. I like Path of Exile 2. I really do. The amount of time I have put into this one game since its release in December of 2024 has been astounding. In my time away from the channel for work and life over the past 2 months, this is the only thing I have been playing in my spare time. I just can't get enough of it. Path of Exile 2 is this game that feels unreal to me. It feels like the true next step in a genre that has been trying to recapture the lightning in a bottle that was Diablo 2 for over 20 years. Not only does it build upon everything Path of Exile 1 has done over its last 10 years of existence, it reinvents itself to be something wholly unique to the genre. It's engaging from start to finish with its absolutely brutal and weighty combat, but also does a lot to make the experience more engaging for players that may have bounced off the original because of its immense depth. It's a mammoth game that stands next to Diablo 4, not only as a competitor in the space, but also as a free alternative with plenty of depth for anyone willing to invest their time and effort into it. However, as I played Path of Exile 2, I came to a realization. Path of Exile 2 is a game split in two. It has the standard act structure one would expect from an ARPG, but then a fully fledged endgame. And these two parts of the game are diametrically opposed. They are uneven. One offers a great, engaging progression model with great moments and really fun boss fights, and the other feels like a waste of time. It's actively punishing, anti-fun, and frustrating on a fundamental level. Even though Path of Exile 2 is still in early access, I think there is a lot to discuss here, so I'm going to do just that. I have put over 150 hours into the game and have a lot to talk about, and when I say a lot, I mean it. I will be covering all of the acts currently in the game, the majority of its systems, as well as the end game. So if you like long form analysis videos like this, send me a like and subscribe down below if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Just like the game, I'm going to split this video into two parts, the acts and the end game. We're taking a deep dive, so stay a while and listen while I tackle everything Path of Exile 2 has to offer. The good, the bad, and everything in between. This is Path of Exile 2. A game split in two.
I'll remove your head myself!
You can bloody well try!
Like any good ARPG, we start Path of Exile 2 at character select. But if you had any doubts about the brutality of the game before you enter, those doubts should be put to bed by now, as the characters you choose from are about to be hanged via public execution. We see a few familiar faces from Path of Exile 1, like the Ranger and the Witch, but we also have some new faces as well, like the Monk, the Mercenary, the Warrior, and the Sorceress, with even more classes to be introduced later in development. I decided to play as the Warrior, as I like big, chunky beefcake classes with lots of killing power, but little did I know the knock-on effects this would have until much later. Just as I finish naming my character, the floor drops beneath his feet, but he narrowly escapes his own hanging and climbs over a ledge to his own freedom. And just like that, we are washed up on the shore of Act 1. No preamble, no nothing, we are just thrown right into the thick of it. And we are given a weapon right away as the game teaches the basics of gameplay. How to move, how to attack, how to equip loot and skills, how to level up, and how to dodge roll. This is all you will need to know in order to play the game. It's all very easy to understand, and the game does an excellent job at getting you into the action and playing without locking out any vital features or abilities behind some dumb level requirements. Now it's just you and your chosen exile against the world of Rayclast. Act 1 really fires on all cylinders for a new player, and we'll dig into that a bit later as I go into discussing the acts more in depth. As of now, I want to discuss picking your character. It can be very difficult to pick classes in ARPGs because you're going to be playing these guys for tens or even hundreds of hours, and Path of Exile is known for its complexity. So let me break it down a bit to make it easier to understand. There are 3 stat categories in the game: strength, dexterity, and intelligence. And all of these classes focus on either one stat or 2 stats as their primary stat to focus on. The Warrior focuses on strength, the Ranger focuses on dexterity, and the Witch and Sorceress both focus on intelligence. The Monk focuses on dex and intelligence, while the mercenary focuses on strength and dexterity. Once you know what each character focuses on, it makes constructing builds and knowing what loot to pick up over others much easier. If you've played Path of Exile 1, the first thing you might have noticed when picking up 2 is how smooth it feels in comparison. And a lot of this has to do with the brand new control scheme that makes it more intuitive to play than any other ARPG on the market. If you're playing on PC, you are given 2 options when you load in. You can do the old reliable click to move, or the option to play with WASD movement and a mouse for targeting, effectively making the game play like a twin stick shooter. I don't want to exaggerate when I say this, but this is literally the biggest, most important change the game has ever made over the original, and it has knock-on effects in how it plays. With WASD movement, the game isn't really an ARPG like how we traditionally see them. You can still play it the old-fashioned way with click movement and pressing keys for spells, but you are actively putting yourself at a disadvantage by doing this. The transition over to WASD movement offers a greater, more precise element of control to the player that is required in order to play at a higher level. The change over to independent movement takes the game in a more aggressive direction, requiring you to push forward while also maintaining your momentum by dodge rolling through attacks, using your healing and mana flasks, and memorizing enemy attack patterns. Basically, using everything in your toolkit to stay alive and succeed. And you're going to need to do all this because Path of Exile 2 is a game that hates you. You can't treat this like a traditional ARPG. You need to treat it akin to something like Dark Souls. Your input as a player is just as important as the loot you decide to equip. Your positioning, timing, and knowledge of enemy attack windows are all imperative in your survival because your health pool in the game is very low. You need to be seated into the locked-in gamer position while you play, or else you're not going to get very far. But it's one of those things I appreciate most about the game overall. The dodge roll I mentioned earlier is probably the most important new addition to the gameplay formula because of how it ties a bow onto the combat package. Not only is it a great feeling roll, it is also deeply imperative to your survival. I should mention that the dodge isn't just a copy paste of Diablo 4's. Diablo 4's dodge is more of a dash that you can add charges to. This dodge is more of a baseline addition to your kit that is needed to experience the game on a fundamental level. It's great for getting out of trouble, but it can also be used for animation canceling your attacks. Position yourself in a bad spot and need to get out of the way of a hard attack? Just dodge. Can't get the skill out in time before an AoE pops below your feet? Dodge away. There's no penalty or cooldown for dodging. It's just as important to your kit as moving and picking things up. It's the bread to your combat's butter. The dodge roll wasn't an afterthought. The game is punishing because of the roll. The combat sandbox was designed with the roll in mind, and now you, as the player, have to play with that in mind. It's not just a game of face slamming your character stats into the enemy's stats anymore. Well, okay, it's still a bit of that, but it now feels like numbers and player input work in tandem to make a really engaging moment-to-moment gameplay loop that asks much more out of you as a player. Combat is so much more weighty as attacks have these well-crafted animations with great payoff, especially for the warrior with his rolling slam. And with almost every skill allowing you to animation cancel, it gives the player greater control over their gameplay experience. However, I must add that not every character is built the same. Every character in PoE 2 has a very unique playstyle that not everyone jives with. I know quite well that a lot of people do not like playing the warrior, and that a character like the monk plays so much better. But I think this is a testament to the game's fantastic class design, where every character feels completely unique from a gameplay perspective. Warrior is for sure one of the slowest attacking classes in the game, but he hits for a lot of damage as a trade-off. But there is also the mercenary, who plays more like a twin-stick shooter character, which completely blew me away when I tried it. I was not expecting something like this in an ARPG, but here we are, and I can't get enough of it. Then there's the witch, who is your go-to girl boss necromancer, summoning a varied army of skeletons to do her dirty work. Every character is going to have their own strengths and weaknesses in terms of combat prowess, so I urge you to try as many characters as possible in as many configurations as you can, because build diversity in PoE 2 2 is already very, very strong, which leads me into discussing one of the things PoE is known for, and it is the mammoth of a skill tree. But let's be real here. This isn't a skill tree. This is a skill network. If you've ever played Final Fantasy X, you might think that this is something very close to the sphere grid, and you would be right. When you zoom out and examine it with some context, it begins to make a lot more sense. Almost every character you play as in PoE 2 starts at a different point on the skill tree, and each of these 6 quadrants of the skill tree represents 1 or 2 of the attributes we talked about earlier: strength, dexterity, or intelligence. Intelligence is north, dexterity is southeast, and strength is southwest. So maybe a skill compass is a more apt comparison. Every node you see in a specific quadrant will focus on one of the 3 primary stats, with everything in between serving a blended purpose. A character's starting position on the skill tree is there to funnel you into a certain direction so you don't absolutely brick your build by focusing on strength as a ranger, for instance. Nodes on the skill tree come in 3 flavors. You have basic attribute nodes, which upgrade one of the 3 attributes. Simple enough. Then there are major nodes, which give major buffs to a certain stat. And lastly, there are key passives, which fundamentally alter a key aspect of your character for one negative trade-off. For instance, if you're playing a sorceress or witch, there is a key passive you can take to turn your entire energy shield pool into mana for your character to use for casting. It's great for a character that has a very high cost spells and a large amount of energy shields at the cost of survivability, because characters that focus on intelligence use energy shields as their primary method of protecting themselves from incoming damage. Leveling is a hugely important part of Path of Exile, and that's why the tree is as big as it is. The amount of build diversity and freedom it gives to the player is frankly insane. The amount of build craft on offer is unlike any other ARPG in the space, and it's one of the reasons why Path of Exile is as popular as it is. And despite being a sequel to Path of Exile 1, this is a completely different playing game. It's a more grounded and difficult experience that wants you to take it slow. This is not a game for everybody like Diablo 4 is, and that's why I love it. I bounced off of PoE 1 countless times because of the stilted gameplay and weird progression, but I fuck with this game big time. There's just something about the leveling process, how meaningful it feels. The moment-to-moment gameplay of Path of Exile 2 is so engaging because of how impactful your attacks feel and how dangerous enemies are to the player. It's that feeling of hunting down a pack of monsters, tearing them down one by one, then making your way to the next pack while picking through loot is what keeps me going. Let's talk about the act structure a bit, starting with Act 1. Act 1 is easily the strongest in the game currently because of the wide variety of content on offer, despite how short it is. As we start making our way through the acts, their lengths get a bit bloated and they tend to drag on a bit, but Act 1 is easily the most refined of all of the ones on offer. It begins in earnest right after your exile leaves the hub and wanders into a snowy lumber camp inhabited by crawling critters and a zone mini-boss. Almost every area in the game has a unique mini-boss that you can only find in that area, which is just absurd. There are how many areas in this game, with each of those areas having their own unique boss? Anyway, these mini bosses usually drop unique items that you can use to level up your character in a certain way. Like they can drop tones that hand you a couple passive skill tree points, consumables that grant your character permanent resistances, and spirit that you can use for passive skills. But we'll dig deeper into skills later. It's always in your best interest to clear these zones of optional objectives because they can offer great benefits to your character, but it also helps that these areas are fun to explore because of their variety in terms of visuals and enemies. Making your way through Act 1, you'll begin to notice that enemies come in all shapes and sizes in Path of Exile 2, and this applies to the entirety of the game. Every zone in the game has a unique set of enemies you will encounter, and very rarely are they reused in other areas. They all behave differently and can alter how you fight in the thick of combat. They have insane telegraphs to let you know when when their attacks are coming, and they come for you like you're the last crab rangoon on the buffet line. Like I mentioned earlier, having your targeting be independent from your movement is very important in this game so that you can survive tough encounters, but it keeps the combat engaging from start to finish. The first big roadblock for any new player in Path of Exile 2 is within the first side area you'll find, and that roadblock's name is the Devourer. He's a giant mudworm that deals poison damage and can spawn little dudes to fuck up your day. If you didn't think Path of Exile 2 was hard until now, you'll be changing your tune after this fight. And if you're still using the old reliable control scheme, it might be time to change to the new one. The Devourer is no pushover and really puts your fundamentals to the test. You'll need to know how to dodge, heal, find your attack windows, deal with ads, and memorize its move pool in order to succeed. This is all in the second area of the game, mind you. Lots of people have died to this creature, but dying in Path of Exile 2 isn't really a big deal. In fact, it's one of the most forgiving death mechanics for a game as difficult as this. When you die in one of the game's zones, you respawn at the nearest checkpoint. All of the enemies respawn, and all of the loot that was previously dropped is now gone, so if you didn't pick it up, that's on you. You don't lose any experience, just your placement in the map. There are checkpoints that help you maintain your progress through a map, but it's still up to you to make progress through the map by besting your enemies. You'll never be in a dead stop on maps like this because as you kill enemies, you are still gaining experience. If a map is too hard and you're dying over and over, you should be finding new loot to pick up and levels to invest to ensure you're in a good spot. It can be frustrating to die over and over in a single area, but I never found this to be an issue until midway through Act 2. The best part about dying in Path of Exile 2 is that armor durability is not a thing. Good Guy Grinding Your Games says, "We know you'll be dying a lot, so we removed armor durability entirely," which is awesome. With durability gone, you aren't punished for failing repeatedly in a tough area. The only punishment you are given is being shoved back to the last checkpoint you found, which isn't really a punishment at all because you now have more chances to get XP and loot from all of the respawned enemies. But dying and respawning isn't all great. Map sizes in PoE 2 are, well, let's just say they're really big, like massive. And I think there are a couple of reasons as to why they are the way that they are. If we compare map sizes to PoE 1, I'd say they are slightly larger, but getting through maps in 2 feels much worse as a result of how slow the character is this time around. With the more grounded and slow approach the game takes to combat, it means that navigating maps and finding new checkpoints can become a real slog. The maps in Act 1 are relatively small, but as you make your way through Act 1 and 2, you'll start to see them get larger and larger for no reason at all. It's not super fun, but I have a feeling this was done as a way to pad out the gameplay to make up for Acts 4 through 6 not being in the game at the moment. It stinks, but I will say that map generation in PoE 2 feels really damn good after playing Diablo 4 for hundreds of hours. Every single area in Path of Exile 2 has its own dedicated tile set, meaning that Area 1 is going to look completely different from Area 2, 3, 4, and so on. It's absurd just how many unique assets were generated for Act 1 alone, and then you realize that same design philosophy carries over to Acts 2 and 3 as well. It helps that the game is a real looker, some really great volumetric lighting, great looking textures, and some very unique looking areas all work in tandem to give the traditional ARPG act structure some much needed pizzazz. And it's not some stupid overworld map despite being an MMO. I swear I'll never forgive Diablo 4 for going that route, and I'm so glad PoE stepped up and put in the effort to make every area in the game truly unique in its own way, with unique bosses and enemies to fight. It makes your progression as a character tangible as you are constantly fighting new things, and there's no dumb level scaling making you feel like your levels are meaningless. If you enter a lower level area as a higher level character, you are going to feel it. Your attacks will explode lower level mobs, so the power fantasy is well and truly alive in PoE 2. One of the biggest things that made me bounce off of PoE 1 was the skill gem slot system. It used to be that most large pieces of loot in PoE 1 would spawn with a skill slot of a specific color, and only skill gems of that color could fit in that slot. And if you wanted to add any modifiers to that skill, you would need to make sure that any adjacent slots were linked up to that initial skill. It sucked. I hated it. Literally the worst part of the game. And hey, if you want to tell me I'm wrong with how bad it sucked, go to the comment section and let me know. But now that stupid gem slot system is gone. It's gone. Now skills have their own independent equip menu, and you have a set number of slots for skills for you to use with their own unique modifier lines for you to equip. The only catch is that the skills you equip are determined entirely by the weapon line you are using. Since the warrior uses a mace, he is locked into the mace skill tree, which I'll take this over the terrible colored gem system from the first game. This is another massive change the game makes over its predecessor, and for the better in every way. Skills are sectioned off into their own tiers, requiring you to pop skill gems of that corresponding tier level to access them. So harder monsters will drop skill gems of those tiers as you make your way through the game. It's a natural way of gating progress while also keeping you experimenting with your character and your build as you progress. Every character plays in a completely different way because of these skills, and it's up to you as the player to decide what works best for you. You're not just spamming one attack, you're juggling a handful to maintain peak combat efficiency. Some skills are needed to deal with mobs, others are single target burst attacks, and a few offer benefits that make dealing with bosses a bit easier. Since I'm the most familiar with the skills of the warrior, let's tackle those a bit. The warrior offers a handful of build paths. You can dual wield maces, have one mace and a shield, or wield a two-handed mace. I opted to go with the two-handed mace for the entirety of my journey because big stick make big damage. I decided to build into stun, armor break, rage, and slams for my journey. As I build stun, the meter below an enemy's health bar fills, and once it gets close to full, an enemy will start to have a white glow on them, meaning that I can pop them with a skill called Bone Shatter. Bone Shatter will break an enemy's stagger meter and have them explode for massive AoE damage. It's a great crowd clearer and helps with dense mob encounters. Armor Breaker was chosen as an attack to whittle down an enemy's armor, which makes them more susceptible to physical damage, which is what a warrior specializes in with his massive stick. I then slot a special passive skill gem into my primary attack that allows me to get a resource called Rage with every hit. Every 1 point of Rage increases my attack power by 1. So every boss encounter, I would whack it to break down the armor, hit him with the basic attack to build Rage, and then when the boss's stagger bar is about to break, I hit him with the good old Bone Shatter for a lot of damage. It's a lot of fun trying to juggle all of these different factors even while fighting run-of-the-mill mobs because there's a flow to it. You have to build the stagger meter, then explode them with Bone Shatter, and if an enemy is a little stronger, you hit him with the armor, you get some rage, you build up the meter, and you blow him up. Many characters in the game have skills like this that build upon one another. For example, the mercenary is able to fire a gas grenade that he can later ignite with an explosive grenade, and the monk is able to summon a damage buffing bell that deals AoE damage. So what he'll do is he'll build up his fast hitting rapid punch skill in order to hit the bell as many times as he can in a row, absolutely demolishing boss health bars. Skill synergy is what sets Path of Exile 2 apart from every other ARPG, and encourages you to play with skills that work in tandem to create some really devastating effects. These are skills you are going to need to utilize to their fullest extent to handle the bosses that cap out each act. The final boss of each act is its own big showdown, and the Count is such a great final boss for Act 1. He starts out simple enough, performing some very easy to dodge melee attacks that can push him through the entire arena, and as you wail on him, it's revealed that he can also turn himself into a wolf and fight like that? Weird, yes. Dope as fuck? Also yes. But like any good boss fight, after he hits a set amount of health, he transforms and gets a brand new skill set. This guy transforms back into a wolf, but gets a set of human arms that help him carry his big ass berserk sword, and it's so badass to witness for the first time. I was pogging out of my gourd while fighting, and it nearly put me on death's door a few times, I'll admit. It's a tough fight, and every boss that caps out each act is for sure a tough one. Thankfully, the checkpoints are always right outside the boss arena, because it very well might take you a few attempts to clear each one. It took my friend group at least 5 tries to clear the count because it was neck and neck the entire time. We were dying trying to avoid AoEs, one was trying to get aggro while another was reviving. Shit was intense. But with enough grit and elbow grease, we came out on top, and man, was it so exhilarating. Never in my life did I think I would praise the boss fight design in an ARPG, but here we are, and I am so here for it. With that, Act 1 is done, and we move on to Act 2. Now, here's where things with PoE 2 get a bit awkward. It's the same game, of course, but this isn't the cakewalk that Act 1 was. When arriving at Act 2, loot and resistances become a much more vital part of the combat equation. Enemies have much more aggressive movesets and mechanics, and maps get much larger and become a bit of a slog. But it's not all bad. Act 2 also changes the progression model a bit to give the player more control over how they want to complete content. We are introduced to the Ardua Caravan, which serves as both the central hub of the act and a vehicle taking our exile to their next location on their quest. It's a really cool concept and is exclusive to Act 2. At around a third of the way through the act, it splits into 3 areas that need to be completed. You can tackle these areas in any order you want, but they will scale in difficulty after the previous one is completed. I suppose it's finally time to talk about loot. Since its importance really starts to become apparent upon entering Act 2, this will be a great place to start the deep dive. Loot is, of course, the last big part of any ARPG. Arguably, it is the most important part of all. Thankfully, PoE 2 delivers on most fronts when it comes to loot generation. Diablo 4, this is not when it comes to loot generation. PoE 2 takes a more traditional approach to loot, taking much of its influence from Diablo 2. Basically, there is a loot pool for every branch of attributes. So you will have specific loot for strength, strength and dex, strength and intelligence, and so on. All in all, there are 6 different armor pools that cover all of the potential combinations of stats. And what you're going to want to do is find the armor pool that best matches your primary attributes. For strength, you're going to want to find armor. For dexterity, you'll want evasion, and with intelligence, energy shield is your go-to. As you progress through each act, these armor pools get updated with new items with different visuals and higher level requirements that will serve as the baseline for that act. Once you understand that, looting becomes much more accessible. With each act, you're going to want to immediately switch to the new tier of higher level loot just to be at the new baseline. Got all that? Okay, now let's get to the fun part. Like any good ARPG, loot will come in different tiers. You have common, magic, and rare loot. Common has no affixes, magic can spawn with 2, and rares can spawn with a maximum of 6 different affixes. So ideally, you're going to want a rare in every slot. But here's the rub. This game doesn't shower you in rare loot like Diablo would. You actually have to play a long time for something of a rare quality to drop, and that's what makes it so valuable. I love this about PoE 2 because it means you are actually playing the loot game for the entirety of your game journey, and it's always a jolt to find that next big piece of gear that you can replace on your character that rolls higher stats and really does wonders for your character's attributes. The loot pool is not weighted either, so you will be finding items for every single class that you can put in storage in case you decide to level a new character. Now, you might be saying, the game is just dropping a lot of garbage loot, or it's dropping stuff that I need but can't use because it's not the right rarity. Well, here's where the fun part comes in. What really sets PoE apart from its ARPG brothers is its focus on loot crafting. Crafting loot in PoE 2 is both really fun and frustrating, but crafting loot in the acts is not as important as it is in the endgame, so don't worry about it too much. As you play, you will start to find these items called orbs. These orbs come in a couple different flavors, and they can be used to upgrade and alter any piece of loot you find in the game. Find a common that you want to make into a rare, you can do just that. Use an orb of transmutation to make that common into a magic item, giving it 1 affix. Want to add another affix to it? The orb of augmentation is your guy. Pop it, and now you have 2 on that bad boy. But that's your limit on the magic item. You want to make it a rare now? May I introduce you to the Regal Orb. One use of the Regal Orb will make that magic into a rare with a 3rd affix. And now you want to cap out the amount of affixes on your new rare? A handful of Exalted Orbs will do the trick. And boom, you now have a fully fledged piece of loot ready to use. There's just one really small, negligible, tiny problem with it. These are all randomly rolled affixes with randomly rolled stats. Yeah, it's not great, but that's the trade-off we have to make when the game gives you the freedom to upgrade any piece of loot you want. So I'm gonna lick the boot a bit and say that the random selection of affixes is actually a really good thing for the game, and dare I say, essential to how the game is supposed to be. The game is supposed to be hard, and if you had the ability to min-max every single piece of loot that gets added to your inventory, there wouldn't be much challenge at all, would there? Of course, crafting items isn't the only way to get good loot, as you can pick up stuff along your journey and compare and contrast to see which is better. If you still can't find anything great, you can always just gamba for better stuff at the local hub vendor. Honestly, this is a pretty goated way to get new loot because you can hard focus a specific piece of loot that you want to replace. The only downside is that it can be pretty costly gold-wise, but you can always sell the duds back to the vendor to make back some of that lost currency. Loot affixes are a little basic compared to stuff that you would find in something like Diablo because it doesn't directly affect specific skills or passives. The passive skill tree and gear are completely separate systems that work independently from each other, but both ultimately affect your character's survivability and damage. The gear is more focused on baseline bonuses like extra health, attack damage, resistances, status effects, and so on. I think a lot of players might find this a little dull in terms of loot generation, and to be honest, it kind of is if you're used to the stimmy stuff that would generate in Diablo. I appreciate the more simple approach to loot generation because it makes things a bit easier to digest from a player perspective. It doesn't force you into a specific build type the game wants you to play and is more general to allow you to play how you want. And if you really want to focus on a certain type of affix for your character, there is plenty of loot that drops to help with just that. But it also has the added downside of potentially making you use the same piece of loot for tens of hours because you can't find anything better, no matter how long you play. That one piece of loot could have just the right affixes and high rolls that you need to survive, so you are encouraged to keep using that singular piece for as long as possible. While I'm on loot, I just need to take a second to talk about uniques, which are uniquely terrible. Uniques in PoE 2 work just like key passives from the skill tree, meaning they have great effects with one large downside. These items do not scale and always spawn with the same affixes that roll within a set parameter. These can be some pretty broken bonuses like flat percentage increases to certain stats, but in most instances the uniques are too specific to fit into any type of build. The trade-off you make by equipping it needs to be accounted for miles in advance on your passive skill tree to have any real benefit, which is cool, I guess. It just means that you're going to need to focus on having rares with higher stat rolls that aren't possible on uniques. It puts more emphasis on the item crafting system to make what you want. Like I mentioned earlier, Act 2 will kick your butt if you're not prepared for it. You're going to need to start focusing on upping your preferred damage negator in order to survive, so now is the time you need to be getting better loot, and now is also the time where you're going to need to focus on capping out your resistances. Don't sleep on resistances because they can make the difference between life and death. If you don't do that, you're gonna get decimated by even a run-of-the-mill mob. For those unfamiliar, resistances come in 4 flavors: fire, electricity, ice, and chaos. The first 3 are very easy to cap out, but chaos is a different story altogether. Chaos resistance does not share the same properties of the other 3 elements and is therefore a bit more difficult to gain coverage for. It's not an uncommon resistance to roll on loot, but you will find it in lower quantities because you can't add it to a piece of loot through a rune, for example. It can only be added via an affix, and getting it to max can be a chore. You don't necessarily need to cap out your resistances in Act 2, but it is recommended because every act past Act 1 is going to put a flat negative modifier on your resistances, meaning it's going to take even higher rolls to hit that cap. It's a bit obnoxious to deal with, but again, not terrible until you really hit the end game. It's a very intentional choice to make the game harder as you progress, but it does kind of force your hand to focus on upping your resistances instead of actually fun affixes stat fixes like movement speed, crit chance, attack damage, and so on. It's all one big trade-off. Are you going to up your resistances and armor types to survive encounters easily? Or are you going to dodge right before every single attack so you don't die and get warped back to the last checkpoint? Act 2 is certainly a bit of a weeding period for players because it takes what Act 1 did really well and kind of makes everything just a little bit worse? Let me put it this way. The number attached to each act is an indicator of how many sittings it will take for you to complete it. Act 1 can easily be busted out in one sitting. Awesome, fantastic, love it. Act 2 takes 2 sittings if you're really gaming, and Act 3 is very long, taking upwards of 3 sittings. Act 2 is not only longer than Act 1, but its maps are larger. It has more content that you are required to progress through. It splits its narrative between 3 objectives that you have to complete in any order you wish, and enemies are much more aggressive with annoying movesets that can get frustrating to deal with. For example, in Act 2, we are introduced to these bone necromancers that can infinitely resurrect these titanic skeletons that deal just absurd amounts of damage. It has poison spitting bird creatures that can absolutely wreck your day if you don't have chaos resistance, and the bosses of Act 2 will really put you through your paces if you're not careful. The kid gloves come off here, so you best be prepared in terms of loot, resistances, new skills, and the right passives to help you thrive in this punishing desert. Speaking of bosses in Act 2, I have a bone to pick with one boss in particular that is probably the worst one in the game for a couple different reasons. The boss in question is this hulking behemoth called Zalmarath the Colossus. PoE 2 only has a handful of oversized bosses that hang off the side of the arena, but this one is easily the worst one. To start, his hitboxes make no sense. Only his arms are truly able to sustain damage, but it's never really clear if you're hitting them or not. The hitbox for the arms is inconsistent at best and non-functional at worst because some of his attacks make him not able to be hit at all. If the boss is there, I should be able to hit literally any part of it to deal damage. His torso is right there. Why am I only able to attack his arms consistently? His arena is very small and very janky. At half health, he destroys the bottom right side of the arena, but it doesn't work very well, and your character can just fly to the bottom of the map and just chill there, but still take damage from the boss. It's just a visual glitch, but it's very annoying when you're trying to lock in and fight this inconsistent mess of a boss. And then there's the health pool, because he has an absurd amount of armor, which only extends the length of an already annoying fight. And to top everything off, he comes built in with what I think are a handful of one-hit kill moves, even on the lower difficulty. Not because the attack does a lot of damage per se, but because of how the attacks work in tandem with the arena. He has this one attack where he sweeps his dagger to the end of the arena and then he retracts it to his torso. If you get caught in between the dagger and his elbow and torso, you get murked instantly, even at full health. I want to say this is the game thinking there's no route of escape and it kills you instantly, or your character is bouncing off all of these objects at such short speed and it makes you take damage from the dagger several times in a row at quick succession, absolutely obliterating your life pool. It could be right, it could be cope, I don't know. All I do know is that I do not like this fight. The jank from every single boss in the game must have gone to this one dude, because I've never had any issues with boss attacks or patterns like I did with this one. It's inconsistent, it's jank, and it's not fun to fight. I have no issues with any other bosses in the game. Every other boss has consistent and readable attack patterns and plenty of hitbox you need to pound the fucking body, so why not this one? Rant over. And as if Act 2 wasn't tough enough, it also introduces a brand new progression system that is essential to your success in the game. And attached to that progression system is this thing called the Trial of Secamus. The Trial of Secamus is an honest-to-God pain in the ass that will make you want to tear out your pubes in frustration. But the end reward is absolutely necessary if you want to play the game for a long time. You get access to the trial very early on in Act 2, but let's be honest, you probably won't be able to tackle it properly until you're about 10 levels past the level it says you need to be. Basically, the Trial of Secamus is a randomly generated series of rooms that caps out in a boss fight. The trial has one unique parameter. You are given an honor meter that matches your current health and energy shield pool, and every point of damage that would have been deducted from your health or energy shield is also reduced from your honor meter. When that honor meter is reduced to 0, you lose and have to restart the trial from the very beginning. So if you don't have a lot of health or energy shield, you have to play extremely carefully. Any hit could easily spell your death. You choose your path through the rooms much like you would a roguelike, with each room offering a reward of some kind. It could be water that you can use as a currency to purchase items that restore your honor, get you boons, or remove debuffs from your character. Each room has the potential to contain a debuff that you carry with you for the rest of the run, so you have to balance your water, your remaining honor, and your chosen path in order to succeed. Which is why I suggest coming in at a later moment so that you have more health, meaning you have a higher opportunity to make mistakes. Higher level means more health and damage, allowing you to crush these lower level trials without any problem. But what really sucks is if you play it in co-op. Anyone who gets hit in the trial has that amount of damage reduced from everyone's honor. So if one player sucks at dodging and gets hit all the time, the other players suffer as a result. The loot at the end of the trial isn't even that good either. In fact, I'd venture to say that it just sucks. But you're not really playing through the trial to get loot. Oh no, you're playing this trial to get something called ascendancy points. See, ascendancy is a completely separate leveling tree from your passive skill tree. Every character gets to choose between 2 different ascendancies, focusing on 2 unique playstyles. For example, the warrior gets the choice between the Titan ascendancy and the Warbringer ascendancy. The Titan focuses simply on getting as much strength, life, and armor as possible. It wants you to play as an unstoppable force and an immovable object at the same time. The Warbringer ascendancy wants you to play with totems and war cries, letting you spam the field with your screams and buddies that spawn from your totems. Both very unique playstyles that exaggerate your existing kit in fun and interesting ways. Most ascendancies have a total of 16 nodes with about 8 key passives each. The caveat is that you are only allowed a cap of 8 total ascendancy points that you have to gain in 2 different ways, either by doing more difficult versions of the Trial of Secumus or by doing the Trial of Chaos, which we will tackle in Act 3. I hate the Trial of Secumus, and I think for good reason. Playing as a warrior who functions primarily at melee range means I am most susceptible to honor loss. Grinding Gear Games rectified this a bit by patching in a 30% reduction to honor loss when at melee range, but it doesn't help much because your health pool is so abysmal as a warrior. Ranged classes have much more freedom to play and make mistakes than a melee character would. Playing as a warrior is like being a second-class citizen in PoE 2. We get the worst type of damage reduction, which we'll tackle later. Our skills are the slowest, and we are glacial on the battlefield because wielding maces makes you stand in place to attack, unlike ranged classes, which you can attack and move at the same time. Yes, it's cope, but let's see you play as a warrior, man. You don't know the pain until you have to go through it yourself. Skills get a little more interesting in Act 2, thankfully, allowing for a little more gameplay variety, just in case you were tired of spamming the same 3 skills to wipe out mobs up to this point. Act 2 is where support gems really come in handy for your skills. Support gems are a really fun mechanic because it gives the player finer control over their build, and without the stupid color gem system from PoE 1, you are not required to go through all the extra dirty work just to link skills together. You just pick the support gem you want, you slot it into the skill you want it to work with as long as it's compatible, and boom, you're done. The only thing you need to know is that you can't have more than one of the same support gems slotted into your skills. You can't have rage build up on your primary attack as well as your rolling slam, for example. It would just be too strong. Skills in PoE 2 are just so much better than in 1 because they are not attached to that stupid color gem slot system. It's much easier to understand and engage with, and it lets you focus more on gearing and keeping your gears separate from your skills. It's fun, and that's what makes it better. While we're on the topic of skills, you might have noticed that you have a new resource type called Spirit on your mana bar. What is that used for? Well, Spirit is used specifically for a type of skill called an aura. If you are familiar with PoE 1, you'll know what an aura is. An aura is a special type of skill that works passively for your character, but this time around you are required to use a chunk of your available spirit. There are only a few ways to get permanent spirit in the game, allowing you to cap out at 100 by the time you hit endgame. Each aura you have on requires a minimum of 30 spirit, and any support gems you have attached to these auras will increase the spirit cost required, so that could go down to 2 auras or even 1 super juiced out aura. As we near the end of Act 2, it might sound like I've been a little harsher on the game, and that's a fair assessment. Act 2 is the one thing in the game that really puts the player through their paces. It teaches them that they need to nut up and play the game by its rules or peace out. To me, Act 2 is the game's way of telling telling the player that things are only going to get harder from here. So you need to make sure you understand their systems on a fundamental level before proceeding, even if it means you are frustrated by them. If you're not okay with how the game handles death or loot generation or the combat loop, this is your chance to bounce. And I can see why people do just that at this point. Act 2 is a little worse than Act 1. It's much harsher, it's unforgiving, but for me, it made me enjoy the game even more. By the end of Act 2, I was more invested than I was previously because I was finally understand how to effectively use my build and balance my affixes that I was given. I had all of my inventory slots filled. Every level I gained got me closer and closer to feeling like my build was coming together. It was a challenge, sure, but I thoroughly enjoyed it despite the frustrations with map size and the Trial of Secumus. Act 2 has a lot of really great surprises and boss fights, except that stupid Colossus, fuck that guy. That after some time made me appreciate what it did teach me as a player. With Act 2 done and wrapped, now we move on to Act 3. Act 3 serves as a very natural extension of Act 2. If you were having a hard time in Act 2, you're probably going to have a hard time in Act 3. And if you had an easy time by the end of Act 2, well, it's going to feel just as easy in Act 3. We return to a much more linear progression model that Act 1 had, which feels great after the Act 2 shakeup. We've got a new set of items to find and equip, a whole new selection of monsters to kill, and more levels to gain. Act 3 is for sure more of the same, and yet it's somehow even longer than Act 1 and 2. Maps in Act 3 are just, they're too damn big, man. Now it's just getting ridiculous. The area right after the new hub is probably the most egregious example. No map in an ARPG where you move this slow should be this huge. Now it's just getting obnoxious and for no good reason other than to pad the game time. Other than that, Act 3 plays it very safe in terms of progression. You're still going to level at a decent clip, you're going to fight a lot of really cool bosses, you're going to do a wee bit of time traveling as part of the narrative, and you'll have noticed that I haven't really talked about the narrative at all so far, and like, it's an ARPG. That's not to say that it's bad or anything, but it's nothing to write home about. Seeing as how the game only has 3 of 6 acts currently in it, I also don't want to give up my impressions on what is an incomplete story. It does do a good enough job leading you from location to location, but it's no Shakespeare. But it doesn't need to be. Bosses have anime villain-ass dialogue, and it's fun enough. That's all I'll really say. The game still keeps up the incredible content cadence even to this point, which I have to give them props for. The amount of unique content for each act is truly remarkable and something the art team at Grinding Gear Games should be proud of. They've really hit it out of the park at giving each act its own distinct flair. With Act 1, we're in a small countryside moving from shore to castle. Act 2 sees the player traverse the desert wastes, seeing everything it has to offer from mine shafts to abandoned temples, enormous towers, boneyards, and even an opposing caravan, which has to be one of the coolest zones in the game by far, even though it doesn't make a lick of sense logistically. Act 3 sees the desert come to an end as we arrive in the humid jungle, complete with ancient ziggurats filled with technology beyond our understanding. Very Mayan inspired, but it still has a vibe all of its own as you fight off nature that is slowly taking control of the old inhabitants. Like, the twin snakes controlling the corpse has to be one of the most sick designs for an enemy in an ARPG I have ever seen. It's simple but effective visual storytelling, which is something the game really thrives at. If you made it to Act 3, it's fair to say that you know what to expect from the game at this point. Combat is still going to be slow but meaningful, and your own combat sandbox has been expanded pretty significantly. You have access to even more skills to experiment and play with, letting you see how they work with existing skills, and even more support skills that are at your disposal as well. You will have become more accustomed to your passive skill tree at this point. You might even have a few key passives that have completely changed your build. To me, Act 3 is where your build really comes into its own. You and your kit are now second nature, and your fundamentals should be polished to a near shine. You know your attack timings, your dodge windows, when to heal. The flow is here, which sucks because of how Act 3 basically ruins the pacing because of the absurd map sizes. I enjoy Act 3 for what it is, but it would be so much better if the maps were more streamlined. With Act 3, we are introduced to a new method of obtaining ascendancy points with the Trial of Chaos. The Trial of Chaos is very different from the Trial of Secumus because it's more of a gauntlet. You are taken through a linear series of challenges with a boss fight at the end. However, these challenges overwhelm you with monsters that really test your combat capabilities. You don't have an honor bar to worry about, just your own life. But with every room you enter, you are forced forced to choose one of 3 negative effects that will persist for the rest of the trial. These could be things like monsters move faster, they have double health, turrets will spawn that shoot projectiles to hinder you, stuff like that. It's a bit easier to game the Trial of Chaos if you know what to expect. You can always go for the negative effects that are easy to avoid, like the spawning AoEs, and as long as you have enough health and defense, you should be able to clear it no problem. I greatly prefer doing the Trial of Chaos over the Trial of Secumus, so I am thankful for its inclusion as a way to get ascendancy points. I'm fairly adequate in my own combat capabilities, so most of the time it's a cakewalk for me. It even has some unique rewards that you can slot into weapons that give percentage boosts to a certain stat, so it's useful even outside of getting ascendancy points. I'll be honest, I don't have a whole lot to say about Act 3 other than its absurd length. Everything about it is pretty par for the course when it comes to PoE 2, meaning that I think it's really good. It's engaging, it has a lot of content to progress through, it's reasonably put me through the ringer, and overall I just had a great time progressing through it. This is where I'm going to wrap on Act 3 because it has some really fun stuff that I don't want to spoil as you near the end, but needless to say, it's more of the same. With Act 3 finished, where do we go from here? Well, since the game is in early access, only Acts 1 through 3 out of 6 are available, with the remaining 3 acts of the game coming at a later date. The developers decided to go with the Diablo route by making you replay the 3 acts once more on a harder difficulty in order to hit the level requirement for Endgame, which is fine. I enjoyed progressing through them the first time, so I'll happily do it again. Thankfully, the developers gave the zones a small shakeup by adding in enemies from other zones into zones they didn't initially appear in, both increasing mob density and putting your resistances to the test. Cruel difficulty is exactly what it says on the tin, but you've been through the ringer before. You can surely do it again. There isn't an official release date for Acts 4 through 6, but if they're anything like the first 3 acts, I have a feeling the game will be very enjoyable up until the level 65 mark. I thoroughly enjoyed my time making my way through Acts 1 through 3 because of the unique boss encounters and just the sheer amount of content it takes the player through. Every area the game ferries you through revels in its own excess. Every area comes with its own unique collection of monsters, bosses, tile sets, quests, and theming that make it stand out from anything that comes either before or after. For a free game, this amount of content at this quality level is simply staggering. I want to make it very clear that I thoroughly enjoyed my time with PoE 2 up to this point. I enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed it much more than PoE 1 because of what it does differently from every other ARPG I've played. It's punishing, but really easy to progress through at the same time. There are a handful of friction points that people will dislike and bounce off of, but that is perfectly natural. A game this slow and difficult with loot that is comparatively dull won't be for everyone, but for someone like me, this hits all of the right notes. This feels like the successor Diablo 2 is needed for a long time. It takes what Diablo 2 does well and meaningfully builds upon it while also giving the formula a much needed shakeup. This one game is going to push the genre forward more than Diablo 4 ever will, and I'm thankful for its existence. And I'm gonna be real, a game like this is something I severely missed after playing Diablo 4 for a couple hundred hours, and I think that the acts in PoE 2 are already top of their class, aside from a few hiccups in the form of oversized map generation, which can easily be rectified. Once maps get smaller and the developers make the journey of Acts 1 through 6 more tight and evenly paced, this will be my go-to recommendation for anyone wanting to start an ARPG. PoE 2 is firing on all cylinders in its campaign in terms of areas, monsters, quests, side content, and bosses, and I cannot wait to see what Acts 4 through 6 have in store. After completing the runbacks of Act 1 through 3 on Cruel difficulty, the game takes you into a brand new area called the Ziggurat Refuge, where you will be spending the rest of your time in the game progressing. This, my friend, is the end game. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it, this is where things get a bit complicated for PoE 2. Upon landing in the Ziggurat Refuge, the world you once knew has been destroyed. Yeah, some shit happened and everything's fucked, but whatever, we still have a game to play. We are introduced to a handful of new systems that will be our bread and butter going forward, starting with the World Atlas. Since the world got destroyed and reassembled, all of the prior regions we played through are now being used as resources for a brand new progression system on this huge, infinitely generating starting map. This map is then randomly assorted with these nodes that you can access via a new resource exclusive to the endgame called Waystones. These Waystones are a one-time consumable that is used to activate the nodes on the Atlas and can be upped to a rare quality just like any piece of loot, increasing the drop rate for more Waystones at the cost of the map it generates being even more difficult. Waystones drop at tiers 1 to 15, with each tier containing enemies that are one level higher than the one prior. So when you start the endgame at level 65, Waystone tier 1 is going to be level 65, and Waystone 15 caps out at level 80. It's a pretty streamlined process that makes it pretty simple to understand. I think the concept of the Waystone and how you upgrade it is an interesting way to handle endgame progression. The Waystones make a very tangible and easy to understand progression system, with the endgame quest stating that you need to complete 10 maps of each tier up to a certain point in order to progress. Upon completion of the 10th map of a tier, you are given a new tome containing 2 level points. But wait, hang on. These don't go in the skill tree. What gives? Well, here's the deal. Endgame actually gives you a skill tree specifically for the Atlas map. Each point you invest into this Atlas skill tree influences things like mob density, Waystone drop rates, item rarity, item quantity, and so on. All really good stuff for an endgame. You've made it this far, so now you should be able to crush lots of dudes at more efficient speeds, getting more Waystones to progress through the Atlas tree, and find these things called citadels that you need to unlock the pinnacle boss that lies within the burning monolith. Your goal is to open that monolith. To simplify it as much as possible, endgame goes like this. Clear map nodes to find citadels. Complete a citadel to get the keys that the bosses within them drop. Use those keys to open the burning monolith. Fight the monolith boss. Done. But that's not all. Nodes on the map all randomly generate with these things called league events that can generate unique materials to unlock even more difficult endgame bosses to fight. The amount of content in the endgame is staggering, but a lot of it has been imported from Path of Exile 1 with a few minor changes. This all sounds pretty good, right? I know I thought so when I decided to lock in and grind out the endgame with my warrior. I thought my build was pretty good. I had an insane weapon that could crush every enemy with one hit, and my bossing capabilities were premium. My resistances were almost capped out at 75. I was set. This was going to be an easy extra few hours on top of the axe I just wrapped up. But God, how wrong I was. Before I proceed to deep dive into the endgame, let me begin by saying that Path of Exile 2 is not a simple game. It's a complex arrangement of a near infinite amount of variables to choose from in terms of your choice of character, your skills, the loot you wear, the passives you pick on your skill tree, etc. I'm just one guy, and I'm not qualified to tackle everything myself. I didn't play with a guide, no build strategies or anything. I just freeballed it. I'm not a terminally online gamer. I just play to have fun, and from my experience with PoE 2's endgame, this has to be one of the most unfun, severely broken, awful endgame experiences I have ever played. It came as a really big shock to me, honestly. I really liked Path of Exile 2 up to this point. So what gives? It all stems from the god-awful Waystone system. Remember how I said that the Waystones are a one-time use? That's half of the problem right there. When you activate a Waystone on the Atlas and the portal spawns, then it's go time. You need to enter that portal, you have to kill every elite monster on that map in order to clear that node and make progress on the Atlas. What the game doesn't tell you is that when you die on a map, you can't go back in. No revives, no second tries, that Waystone is just gone to the aether now. And let's not forget the icing on the shit cake that is when you die on the map, you lose 10% of your XP bar. No, not 10% of your total XP, your entire XP bar. And if you decide to play endgame in co-op, if any group member dies within a map, they can't be revived. It's one and done, meaning that the whole co-op system you've played with up until this point no longer exists. So what happens when you hit a bad roadblock in terms of maps, dying and losing XP is you get stuck in a gameplay loop that ruins your sanity. You can't progress your quest line because you ran out of maps of the tier you needed. You can't get stronger by leveling up because every time you die on more difficult maps, you lose 10% of your XP bar. And since you're forced to do lower level maps because that's all you have left, you have to fight more and more enemies in order to get XP because they give diminishing returns. Everything about this system is designed to truly waste your time, which baffles me because nothing about the game was like this up to this point. The game was still difficult, but not needlessly so. Let me reframe it like this. You're playing through Act 2 and you reach the bone pits, but suddenly an elite mob walks up to you and one-shots you because you didn't have enough defense or elemental resistance, or maybe it just had an insane amount of buffs. You now can't re-enter the bone pits and have to find a map in order to enter it again. You lose 10% of your XP you needed to hit the next level, so now you are forced to grind the lower level area in order to both find a map to get back in and to get back all that XP you lost. To add insult to injury, how the game generates waste stones is very odd. Waste stones inherently have a very, very low drop rate. The only way to up the drop rate of waste stones is to either invest points into the Atlas skill tree or to upgrade the rarity of the waste stones you use. But more often than not, these waste stones very rarely generate tiers above the current level you use to enter. If I enter a map with a tier 5 waste stone, I'm barely getting any tier 6 waste stones, only 5 and below. So not only is my progress getting cock-blocked by insanely mean death mechanics, but also a bully of an RNG system on top of it. See how annoying and obnoxious this is? Why is this just now a thing? What purpose does it serve? Well, in an interview conducted by Gazzy TV and Darth Microtransactions with 2 lead developers over at Grinding Your Games, they discussed just that. Here's what one of them had to say.
To me, I feel like to be a game, you have to have some level of failure being possible. And the 6 portal thing, like it just never really led to a situation where you felt like you really could fail in the same way. So yeah, I'm not really a fan. I much prefer the whole like one death thing. As for XP penalty, part of the thinking around that is that like it's kind of keeping you in the place where you're supposed to be, as far as like, you know, if you're dying all the time, then you're probably not ready to keep going up the power curve. But I mean, maybe that's like the wrong way to look at it. I'm not sure.
Right now, there's too many penalty axes. So if you are dying all the time, you're not going to get maps, and thus you're not going to go anywhere. And you also, it's kind of like an add insult to injury. You're also now just not leveling. So
but
yeah,
you do have to have it. So
I agree. I think there's a few axes, and I think they're just a bit too severe when all combined together.
To sum it up, they think the one death mechanic is very much a necessity for endgame progression. They want your progress in endgame to mean something. You shouldn't be tackling content outside of your wheelhouse too easily, but they do also bring up the fact that you can be caught in a death spiral of progress that leads you into a dead end that requires an absurd amount of grinding to get out of. I am glad that they understand that it's an issue because it has affected me on more than one occasion as I play through with my warrior. This death spiral happened to me about 3 times total as I was playing through the endgame. Once at tier 3, once at tier 7, and once at tier 10. I would hit these tiers and instantly start slamming my face into a wall with 0 progress being made. It sucks. It's unfun. So here's hoping they can rectify this issue with the 1.0 release. Piggybacking off the Atlas and map generation, one of the big goals during Endgame is to find these things called citadels. Like I mentioned earlier, citadels are crucial to your progression in Endgame because they drop these keys that give you access to the boss of the Burning Monolith. They took some time to find, and initially they didn't have anything to help you find them at all. With one of the first major patches added to the game, they would now shoot a beam of light up into the sky to notate their location. Citadels have the same rules as a regular map, but they can only be accessed by tier 15 waystones. Die once, it's over. But you know what's even funnier? On top of losing your very valuable tier 15 waystone and 10% of your XP, the Citadel cannot be re-accessed and moved somewhere else if you die. Damn bro, sorry, looks like you're just gonna have to spend another 3 hours finding one. That is, if your map generation even works like it's supposed to. See, I spent a long time looking for these citadels, but never could because the patch that was supposed to make the beam of light appear at the citadels only worked on one of them for me. I'm convinced the other 2 don't even fucking exist because there was no beam of light pointing me in the right direction. I was playing with no direction or guidance, just doing maps, getting frustrated by the roadblocks, and not doing what the game wants me to do. Womp womp for me. Time to grind another 50 hours to go find these citadels that may or may not exist. I suppose I can get a bit more in-depth with the loot in the endgame at this point. As we enter the endgame, we have a greater understanding of how loot works in general, how leveling works, and how both of these systems work in tandem. Loot in the endgame surprisingly works the same way as it did before, despite every other gameplay system taking a turn for the worst. They are still generated at set tiers, usually in intervals of 5, so gear will generate at level 65, 70, 75, etc. Your elemental resistances are also brought down a flat amount, so you're going to need to find new pieces of loot with higher resistances or loot that can cover more than one elemental resistance at once. And that has this knock-on effect of you having less coverage in other vital areas. When you have to worry about covering your elemental resistances, you are losing out on potential modifiers for damage, defense, health, attack speed, movement, crit chance. You get the point. To counteract this new need for more defense and resistances, loot generation in Endgame is turned up to 11 so you can find what you need, but most of it is garbage. Another thing we need to consider in the Endgame is the economy. The economy is what sets PoE apart from every other ARPG because trading and interactions between players are handled primarily through the economy. Things like exalted orbs, mirrors, and divine orbs are used as the baseline for trading. And for good reason. These are very, very difficult things to come across, so they're incredibly valuable. They wouldn't be nearly as valuable if they were so common, so usually when something goes up for trade on the market, it will go on sale for one divine orb, for instance. But if you're like me, you won't engage with the market at all. It's just not for me. I have no interest in interacting with other players when I play PoE 2, but if you want to make the game easier for yourself, you can do that. My problem with the economy doesn't stem from trading or interacting with other players, but instead the amount of needless slop that just gets added to your inventory as you play. Since the drop rate for loot has been turned up, so too is the drop rate for garbage currencies like Scrolls of Wisdom, Orbs of Transmutation, and Orbs of Augmentation. Yes, these can still be used as a currency, but their exchange rate is abysmal by comparison. You're better off leaving them on the ground to rot instead of picking them up and actually using them. It's just inventory clutter, which is not something I need as a player who's already sorting through even more garbage than usual. That's not to say that these lower level currencies are bad. These still play a vital role in rolling new attributes on loot and waystones in order to make your progression smoother, but the problem with how these currencies that roll modifiers work is that everything they add is random, unless you're working with essences, which do hard focus a specific affix, but those are very rare to find unless you invest points into generating them on your Atlas skill tree. When everything on your item is random, from the affixes you get to the numbers they roll, you are actively fighting against a system that wants you to gamble in order to make any substantial progress. And let's not forget the biggest gambling item in the game, the Val Orb. The Val Orb is the highest form of gambling in the game. This thing has the ability to literally make or break any item in the game. For those unfamiliar, the Val Orb has the ability to add modifiers to an existing piece of loot, give an item an extra rune socket, or it could just not do anything at all. But here's the rub. It can absolutely brick an item as well by reducing its stats or even removing one altogether. Every time you roll a Val Orb, it can either make a piece of loot substantially better, have nothing change, or make it absolutely worse. And once you roll a Val Orb on an item, no more changes can be made to it. It's one and done, baby. I'm not going to say that this is a bad system inherently because of the gambling, because there is no real world financial investment in doing so, but when your progress in the game is literally tied to several hundred rolls of the dice at any given moment, it's hard to have a positive outlook on the system. This is the one thing I liked about Diablo 4's new loot generation system with the ancestral items. You knew when you got a god tier item because when it rolled an ancestral, at least one of the affixes on that piece of loot would always have a max roll. You can tell just from a glance whether something was valuable or not. Whereas in PoE 2, it's more like day trading. You're gonna have good days and bad days as you balance your stat sheet with every new piece of loot you find. You can invest in a decent piece of gear you find, but one bad roll can make the difference between equipping it and trashing it. Again, not bad inherently, and there is a rush to it, but it's not a great system if you want to make solid progress on your own as a solo player and don't want to trade around for better items that other people find. One thing that popped up to me in the endgame is how bad inventory management would be for a free player. Not only do they have to organize and parse everything that drops while doing content, if they want to save anything like currency or any items, they will only have one stash tab to work with. I think it's very doable for a free player to do so, but the game does everything in its power to make inventory management a monumental pain in the ass. You are unable to auto-sort stash tabs or even your own inventory, so everything has to be manually maneuvered around by hand. Let me just say, all of this is by design. Grinding Gear Games did all of this on purpose to incentivize a player to buy the unique stash tabs they have for sale. Now, I am not opposed to these stash tabs, mind you. I think if you're going to put over 100 hours into a game, 1 or 2 stash tabs with unique sorting properties is going to save you a lot of time and hassle. But the lack of access as a free player is meant to waste as much of your time as possible and to make the already tedious process of inventory management even more difficult. Thankfully, when you buy an early access key to PoE 2, the developers are nice enough to give you enough currency to put down onto a few different stash tabs, and they have sales for these tabs every few months, so you can always get them for cheaper than their initial asking price. It still kind of just rubs me the wrong way how the game is designed with bad inventory management as a fundamental part of its gameplay design. It makes a third of your time playing the game needlessly worse than it needs to be. It's 2025, guys. Give us a sort button for Christ's sake. You're going to get drowned with much more loot at this point, with most of it being absolute dog water. And when you're gambling for better loot and respecing to make your character more efficient, you're going to be running out of gold much faster. All of this is to say that you're going to be teleporting back to the refuge, dumping your inventory for cash or disenchanting it for currencies much more often than you were before. And you have to do this because of how difficult the game is now. You're going to be fighting for your life in the endgame because of mob density is turned up to 11, needing more fights, more elemental attacks, more health, more elites. You're going to need better loot if you want to survive here because we both know what horrors await when we die. With this much loot being generated, you are teleporting back and forth more often, leading to so much more wasted time that you could be using to plow through maps. And trust me when I say that map sizes before were nothing compared to how large maps are generated this time around. You thought Act 3 maps are bad? Oh honey, do I have news for you. Not only are maps even larger in Endgame, but are scattered with elites that you have to kill in order to clear it. You'll be walking from one end of the map to kill an elite only for the game to say, oh, actually you forgot one all the way up there that you have to kill. Sorry bro, I don't make the rules. Yes, you fucking do bro. Why is the map this big? Why are there so many elites that I have to kill in order to progress? It's just getting ridiculous at this point. If you weren't convinced PoE 2's endgame was just wasting your time, I hope this fact at least moves the needle a little bit. It's not enjoyable to trudge through this much empty space just so I can clear a map. What's even better is that if the last elite just decides to one-shot me, because that can happen, all that time I had spent on that map is now wasted. Because remember, death is supposed to mean something. Guys, trust me, it's to give a sense of accomplishment. Whatever, man. I'm not super convinced. I wouldn't be so aggravated by elites one-shotting me if the warrior wasn't so terrible to play at endgame. Upon making it to endgame as a warrior, I couldn't help but notice all of his shortcomings when compared to every other class in the game. He's slow. Really slow. His attacks are incredibly clunky by comparison. He has to fight in melee range to even hold a candle next to other characters, which makes him susceptible to high amounts of damage. While I really dig his kit, it just feels really bad because there are only really a handful of viable skills at higher levels. You basically need Bone Shatter to do AoE clear, so what I would do is leap into a pack of enemies to wear down their stagger bar, pop Bone Shatter, then repeat the process. My one true love Rolling Slam has to sit on the sidelines because it's too slow and leaves me too open to taking damage from larger groups. It sucks. What sucks even more is that I've put well over 100 hours into this one character. I'm sunk cost fallacied into playing him now because why would I give up on a character I've put this much time and effort into? Sure, I would love to put time and effort into a ranger or a witch, but I'm already this deep into the warrior. I want to keep playing the warrior, but it feels like the game is doing everything in its power to make me quit without actually saying outright to just do it. The combat in Endgame feels substantially different than how it did before in the Axe. Without the very careful curation of the gameplay experience through the Axe and through the set-piece bosses, combat ends up feeling worse. When enemies hit harder and there are more of them, it's not the careful dance of dodging, attacking, and healing that it used to be. Now it's about getting in, exploding everything, and getting out as fast as you possibly can. Combat isn't supposed to be a slow, curated experience in the endgame. Now it is fast, frenetic, and frustrating. The slow, meaningful progression I got from the Axe is gone, which is what made me fall in love with the game to begin with. Maybe it would be different if I played another class, and maybe my experience with the warrior would have been better if I played with a guide or something similar. But why would I want to do that? I want to play the game on my own terms and make my own build. I just want to play to have fun and freeball it. Why would I let a guide tell me how to play the game just so I can make progress? I wanted to play a warrior because big stick do big damage. It's that simple. And I got that big damage in spades at the earlier levels and I enjoyed it a lot. But in Endgame, it just feels like a completely different story. I was not having fun with Warrior because of the constant roadblocks I was hitting through my journey. I was constantly in a gridlock in terms of progress, and because of how slow the Warrior plays comparatively to other classes, the length of said gridlock was just exasperated to unreasonable levels. Listen, I get it. He's supposed to be slow. He's supposed to hit hard. He's supposed to have a lot of health. Sure, I'll build him how you want me to, I suppose. But where I draw the line is how terrible his primary defense measure is in the game. See, the warrior is ideally supposed to spec purely into armor as his primary defense measure, which makes sense because strength and armor go hand in hand. Slight problem there, buddy. Armor doesn't work like it says it does. Now, why is that? Well, let's say I have a flat 76% damage reduction with armor. Sounds fine and dandy, but it's not quite that simple. Here's a graph on PoE1's armor calculation chart. How it works is when an enemy hits you, its damage is calculated on the fly against your armor. If your armor is higher than their attack value, it will mitigate it by a set percentage. If I have 1000 armor and an enemy hits me for 20 damage, I'm going to reduce that incoming damage by 90%. Not too shabby. However, that's not quite how things work in PoE2 because number values are squished pretty severely. So in reality, the chart is going to look more like this. If an enemy hits me for 5000 damage and I have 20,000 armor, I'm only blocking 44% of that hit. So there goes more than half of my health, which is funnily another problem with the armor equation. Your health pool in PoE2 is much smaller than it is in PoE1. Health in PoE2 is like finding gold. It comes in very small quantities and only a few nodes on the passive skill tree give any meaningful upgrades to it. And even then, they are only percentage upgrades like 3%. 3% of 1000 is only 30 health, which is so fucking funny. PoE2 must think he's a fucking comedian because it's even funnier that classes that use energy shields just have items and skills that increase their energy shield by a set percentage. If you have a single item with a large amount of energy shield and find a lot of gear that can increase your energy shield by a set percentage, like, I don't know, let's just say 38%, just for fun. You are in essence getting 6,000 or more life without it actually being called life, without actually having to invest in any skill points. Sure, it doesn't have any damage reduction, but why worry about damage reduction when you can just face roll everything because your health pool auto regenerates on its own? Now let me be clear. Playing as a warrior, there are no ways to get a locally added percentage of life like you can with energy shield. If I roll an item with a bad amount of energy shields, but then roll a high percentage modifier that can increase it by 133%, for example, it can instantly save that item from mediocrity. The only way to get an increase to health on an item is to either roll a flat health amount or a global increase to health via an amulet, which, might I add, is a very low chance of actually happening. So it makes me ask, why am I, the class that is supposed to have the most health and strength in the game, get beaten down by an enemy 8 levels lower than me because I can barely get past 3k health? It's just absurd. Either armor works or it doesn't. You either wipe a map easily or the map wipes you. There is rarely any in between. I don't remember if I recorded this or not, but at one point I started a delirium run encounter and the first enemy that spawned one-shot me. I had just started the map, I didn't see the guy, he spawned, killed me, and there was nothing I could do about it. Really cool, really dope, let's roll another. But after hitting the quest for tier 14 maps and failing the first citadel I stumbled upon, after looking for over 30 hours for a single one, I had a conversation with myself. I asked myself, why am I still playing this? Why do I continue to play something that doesn't respect my time? The endgame experience for Path of Exile 2 has been nothing but monotonous, punishing, aggravating, and I ultimately decided that I just can't keep doing this, man. I am not having fun playing the game anymore. After over 100 hours on a single character, I had to put the game down. I didn't really know what I was playing for anymore. Sure, I didn't hit max level at 100, but at some point, you have to take a step back and ask if all of this gameplay is even worth it. After 100 hours, I think I'm good with Path of Exile 2 until its final release. I absolutely loved what I played in Acts 1 through 3 with a handful of issues that I think could easily be improved upon, but Endgame encapsulates all of those issues and somehow makes the primary gameplay experience worse without adding anything substantial. The inventory management, map sizing, monster strength, waystone system, the 10% XP loss for dying, the straight up loot gambling are all working in tandem to waste as much of your time as possible. I guess the endgame is one thing Diablo 4 still has over Path of Exile 2 at this moment in time. Diablo 4 didn't waste my time because it felt like I was actually making tangible progress with my character. I had something to look forward to at the end of every pit so I could level up my runes. I was still leveling at a decent pace because of the Paragon system. I was still doing the loot grind, on the hunt for ancestral items, but it just doesn't feel like I'm doing anything in Path of Exile 2 other than getting frustrated. Look, I still enjoy the fundamental gameplay loop of the game. I think it's a testament to the game's design that I decided to clock over 100 hours on what many people would consider to be the worst character in the game. I'm also sure that if I didn't have any other games to play or a job, then I would happily crush another 100 hours into this character and learn even more of what the game has to offer. There is still a mountain of content for people to engage with here if they have the time, but let's be real. This game wants you to make it a part-time job, but I'm not gonna do that. If you want a part-time job with a boss that spits in your coffee every morning, gives you the hardest work that you can possibly do, all while paying you scraps and expecting you to stay, then this is the game for you. Well, maybe it's more of an abusive relationship than it is a job. If you enjoy it, I'm happy for you. I truly am. But I've had enough. I'm leaving and I won't be coming back until the other acts are here. If the endgame changes, I will debate spending more time in it, but as it stands, it straight up sucks. It sucks really bad. So, that's Path of Exile 2. A great game with fantastic fundamentals that is absolutely ruined by a dog water endgame experience that wants you to hate it more than it hates you. I really wish I could end this video on a better note, but I just can't with the game in its current form. Everything about the gameplay makes me want to play more and more, and I might even start leveling some new characters from scratch just because the acts are so much fun to progress through. Time might be the one thing that fixes the game the most, and grinding your game's content cadence is top tier when it comes to seasons, so I'm expecting a lot of great new content to be added to the game as it reaches its 1.0 release. It's just a shame that it's such an uneven experience in its current form. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think about Path of Exile 2 in the comments below. Do you like it more than Path of Exile 1? Do you think it's too hard? What do you think of the endgame? Special thanks goes out to my channel members listed here, with extra special thanks going out to Cilantro. The financial support from these fine folks helps keep me going and making videos for the channel, and if you want to see your name up on the screen just like them, consider becoming a channel member yourself by clicking the join button below. I gotta say, it feels so great to be back. Work was kicking my ass these past 2 months, but I am officially back with new videos. My next video will be about Marvel Rivals, so please look forward to that. YouTube seems to think that you will like these videos up on the screen, and until next time, this has been Testing Triangles. Thank you so much for watching.